The air was thick with dust and tension, the kind that clung to every corner of the frontier town. It was the kind of place where hard bargains were struck in the daylight, and harsher ones in the shadows. Men leaned against railings with arms crossed, spitting tobacco into the dirt, as though the land itself wasn't already dry enough. Women stood back, their faces half hidden by bonnets, pretending not to look while their eyes caught every detail. The square was crowded that day, and all eyes were fixed on the auction block. The sound of the auctioneer's voice carried across the yard, sharp and commanding, each word meant to pierce through the heat and the murmur of the crowd. The rhythm was steady, rehearsed, almost like a drumbeat that pulled people deeper into its spell. Horses had been traded that morning, rifles too, but now the energy shifted. This was the part of the sale that tightened jaws and set teeth on edge. When people talk about the old American frontier, they often remember the wide skies, the smell of pine after a storm, the way the horizon seemed endless. But they also remember the cruelty, the lawless corners, and the way some lives were treated like property. She stood at the center of it all, her wrists bound, her hair tangled from the journey, her eyes wide with something fierce inside them. Fear, yes, but not just fear. There was defiance too, though she kept it hidden beneath lowered lashes. The crowd leaned forward, studying her as if she were an object to be judged, weighed, and measured. Yet something about her made the air feel different. She did not belong to this place or to these men who were bidding like it was nothing more than a game of cards. No one knew her whole story. They did not care to ask how she had come to be here, nor did they wonder what dreams she might have carried before fate had thrown her into chains. They only cared about the price. But in her heart, she held on to the memory of freedom, of a time when her laughter echoed under an open sky. When she ran without fear, when she was more than just a body standing beneath a stranger's gaze. The auctioneer barked louder, calling out numbers, his voice rising above the dust and mutters. A man in the back tipped his hat, making an offer. Another raised his hand, then another. The bids came faster, and each time her stomach tightened. She clenched her jaw, refusing to let tears fall. She would not give them that. The crowd pushed closer, eager to see who would win. Some laughed, some whispered. The world seemed to close in, pressing down until she could barely breathe. Then, just as the auctioneer prepared to close the deal, something shifted in the crowd. It began with the sound of hooves, not the slow, lazy trot of a town horse, but a hard gallop cutting through the dirt like a storm rolling in. Heads turned. A figure on horseback broke through the haze of dust and sun, his presence commanding enough to silence even the auctioneer. The horse reared, powerful and restless, as though it carried the weight of its rider's urgency. The man on its back was unlike the others. His skin bore the bronze tone of the desert sun, his dark hair tied back, his eyes sharp and unyielding. He was Apache, and the crowd knew it the instant they saw him. A ripple of unease spread across the square. Whispers rose, questions too, but none dared step forward. The Apache's gaze fell on her, steady and unwavering, as if he had come for this moment alone. Before anyone could react, he seized the reins of her rope, his hand swift and sure. His voice rang out, not in hesitation, but in command, carrying the weight of survival. "Come with me." The words cut through the silence like lightning. For a split second, no one moved. She stared up at him, her breath caught in her chest. The crowd was stunned, frozen between fear and disbelief. The auctioneer sputtered, trying to find his voice, but it was drowned out by the sound of the horse shifting beneath its rider. She did not think, she could not. Something inside her stirred, the same something that had refused to die even in the darkest nights. Her legs moved before her mind caught up, and suddenly she was running, the rope falling loose, the world spinning around her. The Apache leaned down, his arms strong, as he pulled her onto the horse behind him. Gasps and shouts erupted. Someone cursed. Someone fired a shot into the air, but the horse was already surging forward. Hooves tearing into the earth, carrying them away from the square, away from the chains, away from the men who had thought they could own her. Her heart pounded against her ribs, every beat a reminder that she was still alive, that freedom was not yet lost. Dust rose behind them in a cloud, blurring the faces of those who gave chase. The wind tore at her hair, stung her eyes, but she clung to the Apache's waist, her fingers digging into the leather of his belt, holding on with all the strength she had left. The town shrank behind them, but the danger did not. Shouts grew fainter, yet the echo of pursuit still lingered. She knew this was not safety, not yet. What lay ahead was uncertain, maybe even more perilous than what she had left behind. And yet there was something about the way he rode, the way his shoulders never wavered, the way his voice had carried command without question, that made her believe it only for a fleeting moment that she had chosen right. The horse thundered down the dry road, past the edge of the town, and toward the open land where the horizon stretched wide and wild. Behind them, men scrambled to give chase, rifles in hand, horses hurriedly mounted. The sound of pursuit grew again, faint but real, a reminder that escape was not a clean cut but a desperate fight. She tightened her grip, her breath shallow. She did not know this man, did not know where he was taking her, or if she could even trust him. All she knew was that he had come when no one else dared, and that he had spoken words that cracked open the iron walls around her heart. The sun burned high, the dust rose thick, and the land stretched endless before them. The chase had only begun, and the line between safety and capture was razor thin. She felt the weight of it, the pull of fear and hope tangled together, and she knew the next moments would shape everything. Behind them, the sound of hooves grew louder again. The men had not given up. The town had unleashed its fury, and it was coming fast. She pressed closer to the Apache's back, her voice trembling as she whispered into the wind, unsure if he could hear her over the roar of the ride. "Where are we going?" His answer was not yet given, for his focus was fixed ahead, on the wilderness waiting to test them both. The reins tightened in his hands, and the horse pushed harder, carrying them into the unknown as the voices of their pursuers closed in. And in that breathless moment, caught between capture and freedom, her fate hung in the balance, waiting for what would come next. The land opened wide before them, stretching in shades of gold and rust beneath the heavy sun. Sagebrush bent in the wind, and the sound of hooves striking hard earth echoed like a drumbeat of survival. She pressed closer against the Apache rider, every muscle in her body taut with fear and the thrill of running. Behind them, the thunder of other horses still rolled, faint but steady. The men had not given up. The world felt caught between silence and chaos, and she could not tell which side would claim them. Her mind spun with questions. She did not know who he was, only that his presence was unlike anything she had ever seen. He carried himself with certainty, the reins firm in his hands. His back straight and unshaken, even as the dust swirled, and danger followed. She wondered if he had been watching her from the shadows of the town, waiting for the right moment. She wondered if he had risked everything for her, or if there was some reason yet unseen. Whatever the truth, she clung to him as though her life depended on it, because it did. The horse charged through the dry scrub, each stride carrying them farther from the town. Her heart pounded, her thoughts tangled. The memory of the auction burned in her mind, the faces staring, the voice of the auctioneer, the way her spirit had been weighed and measured. She had stood there bound, stripped of everything but her will, and then suddenly this man had appeared, cutting through it all like a strike of lightning. Now she was free, yet not safe. Not yet. The Apache glanced back once, his dark eyes sweeping over her face, before turning again toward the horizon. He did not speak. She wondered if he could hear the panic in her breath, or if he even cared. Wanted to ask why he had chosen her. What made him ride into that square without fear? Instead, the words stayed locked in her chest. For now, the only sound was the steady rhythm of hooves and the cry of a hawk circling far above. The sun sank lower as they rode, shadows stretching across the land. Finally, after what felt like endless miles, he guided the horse down a narrow trail that cut into a dry gulch. The walls of earth rose around them, shielding them from sight. The noise of pursuit faded, though she knew the men could not be far behind. He slowed the horse at last, pulling them to a halt beneath an overhang of rock where the heat softened, and the air smelled faintly of dust and sage. She slid down from the horse, her legs trembling, unsteady after the wild ride. She pressed her hand against the stone to keep from falling. He dismounted in one fluid motion, his movements sure and practiced. For a long moment they stood facing each other in silence, the weight of what had just happened hanging between them. Her voice came out rough, strained by fear and dust. "Why did you take me?" He studied her, his eyes unreadable. The pause stretched so long, she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "Calm and steady, because you do not belong in chains." The words settled into her like a stone dropped into water, rippling outward. No one had spoken to her like that in a long time, as though she were more than just what others had tried to make her. Still, doubt gnawed at her. Freedom was not given without cost. She had learned that truth too many times. "You don't know me," she whispered. "I do not need to," he replied. "I saw enough." His certainty unsettled her as much as it comforted her. She wanted to trust. But trust had been taken from her piece by piece, broken until she had nothing left to offer. And yet here she was, standing in the shadow of a rock with a stranger who had risked himself to take her away. The sound of distant hooves echoed faintly down the gulch. Her body tensed, and she turned her head toward the noise. He heard it too, his jaw tightening as his hand rested lightly on the handle of the knife strapped at his side. "They will not stop," she said. "No," he agreed, his eyes narrowing. "But the land is wide. It will test who is willing to chase." The way he spoke made her realize he knew this land in ways she could not. To him, the desert was not empty, but alive. Filled with paths and secrets, with shadows to hide in and rivers that revealed themselves only to those patient enough to wait for rain. She had grown up with walls and streets, with corners that closed her in. Out here, the sky was too vast, the silence too deep. Her throat tightened as she thought of what would happen if the men caught them. They would not be merciful. She pictured their faces, the greed in their eyes, the sound of coins clinking in eager hands. She felt the cold bite of fear again, sharper now in the stillness. The Apache watched her carefully, as though he could read every thought she tried to hide. "You are afraid," he said, not as an insult, but as a simple truth. "Yes," she admitted, her voice breaking. "I don't know where this ends." "Neither do I," he said. "But you have a choice now." The words stirred something inside her. Sparks, she thought, had died long ago. Choice. The word itself felt heavy, unfamiliar, like holding a tool she had forgotten how to use. Before she could answer, the sound of pursuit grew louder, bouncing off the walls of the gulch. Shouts carried faintly in the distance. She turned wide eyes toward him, but he was already moving, leading the horse deeper into the cut of the land. "Come," he ordered. She hesitated only a moment before following, her feet stumbling on the rough ground. Every step felt like stepping further into a story she could not see the end of. The gulch twisted and narrowed until the voices faded again, swallowed by the rocks. Still, she could not shake the feeling that eyes were watching, that the desert itself was holding its breath. At last they stopped in a hollow, where the walls rose high and the shadows deepened. He tied the horse and crouched near the ground, studying the tracks. She watched him, the way his fingers traced the dirt, the way he seemed to hear things no one else could. He looked up at her at last. "They will follow, but not tonight," he said. Her chest loosened slightly, though unease still gnawed at her. "And tomorrow?" He did not answer. Instead, he rose and studied the horizon where the last streaks of sunlight faded into dusk. His silence told her enough. Tomorrow was a battle yet to be decided. She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering though, the heat still clung to the air. Questions pressed at her: who he was, why he had risked everything, where he intended to take her, but the answers lay beyond her reach. All she knew was that the night was coming fast, and with it, more uncertainty. As the stars began to pierce the sky, she sank down onto the hard ground, exhaustion pulling at her bones. He remained standing, a lone figure against the darkening sky, his presence both strange and steady. Wanted to believe she was safe, but safety was a word she had forgotten how to trust. The sound of coyotes carried across the distance, sharp and haunting. The land felt alive with secrets, every shadow holding a story untold. She closed her eyes for a moment, listening to the wild calls, and thought of the words he had spoken. "You have a choice now." Yet even as the night settled around them, she could not escape the thought that choice was a fragile thing, easily stolen, easily crushed. And though she had escaped the auction, the chains of fear and uncertainty still bound her, dragging her into a future as unknown as the man who had carried her away. The desert wind rose, whispering through the rocks, and she knew sleep would not come easy. Somewhere beyond the darkness, men still searched. Somewhere ahead, paths wound deeper into danger. And by her side, the Apache watched in silence, a guardian, or perhaps a stranger, whose reasons had yet to be revealed. The night stretched on, heavy with questions, and the only certainty was that nothing about her life would ever be the same again. The desert night was sharp and unrelenting, colder than she had expected. The silence carried a weight of its own, broken only by the occasional call of an owl or the restless shuffle of the horse tied nearby. She sat with her knees pulled close, trying to hold warmth against her body, while her mind turned restless. The Apache had not said much since leading her into this hidden hollow, and though his presence made her feel less alone, it also stirred unease. He seemed like a man who belonged more to the land than to people, a man who carried secrets in his silence. She studied him as he crouched near the fire he had built with a careful hand. The flames licked at the dry branches, throwing light across his face, revealing a calm focus that unnerved her. He did not look worried, though she knew the men who hunted them could not be far. She wondered if he was fearless, or if he had simply lived too long with danger to fear it any more. Finally, her voice broke the stillness. "They won't stop. Those men will keep coming until they have me again." He looked at her, his eyes catching the firelight. "Then they will have to ride farther than they are willing. The desert tests every man." It was not an answer that eased her heart, though she could not deny the certainty in his tone. She thought of the faces in the crowd, the greed that burned in their eyes, and the sound of coins changing hands. Men like that would ride until their horses collapsed. Men like that did not forget what they thought belonged to them. She pressed her lips together, staring into the fire. "Why risk yourself? Could have left me there. Why take me away?" He paused, as if measuring his words. "I saw a spirit that refused to break. That is worth saving." She wanted to believe him, but suspicion lingered. In her life, no one had given without expecting something in return. She had learned to guard herself, to distrust gifts that came too easily. Still, when she remembered the way he had shouted, "Come with me," and pulled her from the auction block, she felt something she had not felt in a long time: hope. Fragile, trembling hope. The night stretched on. He kept watch while she drifted in and out of restless sleep, waking often at the sound of some unseen creature moving through the brush. Every time her eyes opened, he was still there, awake, listening to the land. When the first light touched the horizon, they set out again. The desert seemed endless, a sea of dust and rock stretching beneath the pale morning sky. She rode behind him, clinging tight as the horse carried them deeper into the wilderness. Her body ached from the strain, but she dared not complain. Each mile put more distance between them and the town, yet her unease grew heavier. She did not know where he was leading her, only that his eyes seemed fixed on a path he could see, but she could not. As the sun rose higher, they came upon a narrow canyon, where water trickled faintly from a spring. He stopped there, letting the horse drink while she knelt by the stream, splashing the cool water against her face. For a moment she felt almost human again, not just a hunted prize. She cupped her hands, drinking deeply, her reflection rippling across the surface. She barely recognized the woman staring back, dust in her hair, shadows beneath her eyes, but something fierce there too. While she rested, he scouted the canyon walls, his gaze sharp as a hawk's. When he returned, his expression was grim. "They follow," he said. "I see their dust on the horizon." Her stomach clenched. "How many?" "Enough," he answered, his voice flat. Wow, they are not men who turn back easily. The tension settled thick around them. She looked at him, searching for some sign of doubt, but found none. He carried himself with a steady strength that both comforted and frightened her. She realized then that his fight was not just with the men chasing them, but with the land itself. Every step was a battle against hunger, thirst, and exhaustion. As the day wore on, the sun grew crueler, beating down without mercy. Her lips cracked, her skin burned, and every breath felt heavy with dust. And yet he pressed forward, guiding the horse with purpose. She wanted to ask again where they were going, but she held her tongue. Perhaps he would not answer, or perhaps she was afraid of what the answer might be. That evening they found shelter beneath the twisted branches of a mesquite grove. He built another small fire, careful to keep it low and hidden. She sat across from him, watching the sparks rise into the night, her mind racing. She could not stay silent any longer. "What happens if they catch us?" she asked softly. He did not look away from the fire. "Then we fight." Her throat tightened. "And if we lose, then you lose nothing more than chains," he said. She stared at him, struggling to understand. "In you, what do you lose?" He finally met her eyes, his gaze steady. "A chance to do what is right." The words struck her harder than she expected. She had lived among people who measured everything by gain and loss, by coin and trade. But this man spoke as if honor meant more than survival. She could not decide if that made him a fool or something greater. The night passed slow, haunted by the sound of distant wolves. She dreamed of the auction again, of the crowd pressing in, of the hand that had pulled her away. Each time she woke, her heart raced, and she found him still awake, his knife glinting in the dim firelight. Days blurred together as they traveled deeper into the wild. The land shifted from open desert to rough hills, where jagged rocks cut the horizon.
Ow.
The air grew cooler at night, but the threat of pursuit never faded. Sometimes in the distance, she thought she heard the echo of hooves. Sometimes she imagined men's voices carried by the wind. Each time he would stop, listening, watching, before leading her onward. It was during one of those nights that she dared to ask about him. "Who are you truly?" He hesitated before answering. "I am of a people the frontier would rather forget. My home lies where the mountains touch the sky. I ride not for glory, but because I will not let what I saw in you be broken." She turned those words over, unsure whether to believe them. His life seemed carved by hardship, his silence carrying stories he had not yet spoken. She wondered if he had family somewhere waiting, or if he was as alone as she had been before he found her. The days stretched on, the pursuit tightening like a noose. Though the desert was wide, the men behind them were relentless. Each time she began to think they had gained ground, new signs appeared, hoofprints in the dust, smoke on the horizon. The chase became a shadow that never left. One night, as the fire burned low, he said, "There is a place we may reach, a camp hidden in the hills, but we must ride hard. If they find it, all is lost." Her heart pounded. "A camp? With others?" "Yes," he replied. "People who know what it is to run, to fight, to endure." The thought filled her with both hope and dread. To find others meant safety, perhaps even belonging. But it also meant more lives at risk if the men caught them. As dawn approached, they prepared to ride again. She felt the weight of choice pressing heavy on her chest. Freedom had been given back to her, but freedom was fragile, hunted, and uncertain. She'd escaped the auction, but she had stepped into a different kind of trial, one that tested not just her body but her spirit. When the horse carried them into the pale light of morning, the wind sharp against her face, she realized the conflict was no longer just about running from those who hunted them.
Oh.
It was about deciding who she was in the wide, merciless land, someone who surrendered or someone who fought to remain unbroken. And as the horizon stretched before them, endless and wild, she knew the fight was far from over. The men were still behind them, the questions still unanswered. The path ahead was shadowed with danger waiting to rise. The sky was pale when they set out again. The kind of pale that carries no warmth, only a warning of the heat that would soon fall across the land. She rode close behind him, her hands gripping the leather as the horse surged forward. The trail wound narrow between ridges of stone, the ground uneven, and every sound seemed sharper in the stillness. She could hear the horses breathing, the scrape of hooves on rock and the faint, distant rumble that meant their hunters were still out there. For days they had moved without rest, their only stops taken in hidden places where the rocks and brush could shield them from sight. Each night she had thought the danger might ease, but each morning brought signs that the chase had never ended. Tracks in the dust, ashes from a campfire still warm. A hawk startled from the cliffs, circling as if it too watched the pursuit below. It was as though the desert itself had turned against them, refusing to grant shelter. The Apache never faltered. His eyes were always fixed ahead, his movements measured, his silence unbroken, unless it was necessary. She began to understand that he did not waste words because his life had taught him to let the land speak first. Still, his silence left her with her own thoughts, and those thoughts weighed heavier each day. What if they did not reach the hidden camp in time? What if the men behind them found it first? What if all she had gained was another kind of prison, only this time in the wilderness? By the third evening, the signs of pursuit had grown closer. As they climbed the slope of a ridge, she looked back and saw it for herself. The thin trail of dust rose in the distance, no longer faint but clear. The riders were not far. Her stomach knotted, her throat tight. She gripped his shoulder to get his attention. "They're close," she said, her voice sharp with panic. I know, he replied without looking back. The steadiness of his answer should have calmed her, but it only made her heart race faster. If he knew, why did he not push harder? If he knew, why did he not look afraid? The questions burned inside her, but she swallowed them down. Fear wasted breath, and breath was a thing she could not afford to lose. That night, when they found shelter beneath an overhang of rock, the stars felt cruel in their brilliance. She could hear the distant echo of laughter, though whether it was men carried by the wind or the tricks of her weary mind, she could not say. She pressed her back against the stone, her eyes never leaving the fire he had built. They will catch us, she whispered finally, unable to bear the silence. He looked at her then, his face calm, but his eyes carrying something darker. If they do, you must not stop fighting. Do you understand? She shook her head, fear choking her. I don't know how you do, he said firmly. I saw it the moment you stood on that block. Your spirit was not broken. That is your weapon. His words dug deep, though she was not sure she believed them. Still she nodded, because to do anything else felt like surrender. Sleep would not come. Every rustle of leaves, every shift of the horse, every whisper of the desert wind kept her eyes wide. When she did drift into uneasy dreams, she saw the faces of men who would rather see her chained, their voices calling like a chorus that haunted the night. She woke before dawn with her heart pounding and her hands clenched into fists. The next day, the chase tightened further. By midday, they heard gunfire crack through the air, the sound bouncing between the ridges. The shots fell wide, not close enough to harm, but close enough to remind them how near danger rode. The Apache urged the horse forward, the animal's muscles straining as it leapt over rocks and tore through dry brush. She clung to him, her breath ripped from her lungs with every stride. Her mind filled with images she could not escape, men closing in, hands dragging her down, the sound of laughter when freedom slipped away again. She pressed her face against his back, her grip desperate, whispering prayers to no one in particular. As the sun began to sink, they crested a high ridge, and she saw it at last, the land changing ahead. Beyond the rolling stone and scrub stretched the faint outline of forested hills, green against the endless desert. Somewhere in those hills lay the camp he had spoken of, though it was still too far to reach before nightfall. Her hope rose and collapsed in the same breath. They're still behind us, she gasped, looking back to the rising dust below. They are closer than before, he admitted. Tonight we cannot stop. Her body ached, her lips cracked with thirst, but she said nothing more. Words would not change. The distance still left between them and safety. The night that followed was the hardest yet. They rode under the pale glow of the moon, the land stretching strange and ghost-like in the silver light. The horse stumbled often, weary from the days of running, and each stumble sent terror flashing through her. If it fell, they would be finished. The Apache guided it with patience, whispering in his tongue, steadying both beast and rider with the same calm that had carried them this far. By midnight, her head swam with exhaustion, her arms numb from holding on. She thought of giving in, of letting go, of sliding from the saddle and letting the desert take her. But each time the thought crept close, she felt the strength of his back before her, the steady rhythm of his breath, and she forced herself to hold on. Near dawn, a shout split the silence behind them, sharper than the cry of any night bird. The hunters had closed the gap. She turned, her stomach twisting, and saw their outlines against the rising light, dark shapes moving fast, rifles glinting. The sound of hooves cracked like thunder across the land. Her voice broke with terror. They're here. They're no. His jaw tightened, but he did not falter. Hold fast. The horse plunged forward, hooves striking hard, but the gap closed quickly. Gunfire rang out again, bullets kicking dust into the air around them. The sound tore through her ears, rattled through her bones. She pressed herself tighter against him, praying the storm of lead would not find its mark. The desert seemed endless, yet the riders behind seemed tireless. Each stride was stolen time, each breath a risk. She felt the chase reach its peak, the line between survival and capture narrowing until it was thin as a thread. Her body shook, her heart roared, and still they rode on. In the distance, the hills rose taller, the promise of shelter drawing near. But the men behind had tasted blood, and they would not relent. The Apache leaned low, urging the horse harder, his voice sharp and urgent in his native tongue. She could not understand the words, but she felt the fire in them, felt the raw determination that carried them both. The morning sun broke over the ridge, spilling gold across the wild land. The forested hills lay just ahead, close enough to see but still far enough to remain out of reach. Behind, the riders pressed harder, their shouts filling the air, their gunfire growing wild with hunger. Her breath came ragged, her fingers locked tight around his belt. The horse thundered beneath them, each stride a desperate gamble. The world narrowed to the sound of pursuit, the pounding of her heart, and the wild rush of the wind. And as they surged toward the line where desert met forest, she knew they had reached the edge of something. The conflict that had chased her since the auction square was no longer a shadow on the horizon, it was upon them. Fierce and merciless, and the moment of reckoning drew near. The horses' hooves struck the earth with desperate force as they drove forward into the rising sun. Every stride carried them closer to the forested hills, yet the distance still felt like a lifetime. The shouts of the riders behind tore through the air, mingling with the crack of gunfire. She clung to the Apache, her body shaking with fear, her heart pounding so loud she could hardly hear anything else. The moment stretched tight, fragile, as though the world itself held its breath to see which side would falter first. When the first trees of the forest rose before them, tall and dark against the desert's edge, she felt a surge of hope so sharp it nearly brought her to tears. The Apache urged the horse harder, his body leaning into the ride, his voice steady, even as chaos closed in around them. Bullets struck the ground, throwing dust into the air, but none found their mark. She realized then that the wildness of the land itself was their shield, scattering the aim of men who had grown too eager, too desperate to win. They plunged into the shadow of the trees. The world changed at once, the air cooler, the ground softer, the sounds of the chase muffled beneath branches. The horse slowed slightly as the path narrowed, weaving between trunks and roots. She dared to look back and saw the riders struggling, their horses less sure-footed in the sudden shift of terrain. Relief bloomed inside her, but it was tempered by the knowledge that the danger was not yet gone. The Apache guided them deeper into the forest, his eyes searching for paths invisible to her. At last, he slowed the horse to a steady trot and finally drew them into a clearing where the land opened wide enough for rest. She slid down from the saddle, her legs weak, her hands trembling. She pressed her back against a tree and tried to breathe, but her chest still heaved with the memory of the chase. For the first time, she allowed herself to speak what had burned in her since the moment he seized the reins back in town. "Why me? You could have left me there. I risked everything for someone you didn't know." He looked at her, his face calm, his words measured. "Because you remind me of my people, taken, traded, treated as less. But spirit does not break so easily. Could not leave you." She lowered her eyes, overwhelmed by the weight of his answer. She thought of the auction square, the faces of men who saw her as nothing but a prize. She thought of her own voice, silenced for so long by fear and loss. And she thought of the moment he had shouted, "Come with me," and how it had cracked open the chains around her heart. The forest seemed to hold its silence for them. Only the rustle of leaves and the call of birds broke the stillness. For the first time since her escape, she felt the faint stirrings of peace. They did not linger long in the clearing. He knew the riders would not give up, even if the forest slowed them. As dusk fell, he led her through winding trails, each step taking them deeper into the wild. At last, after hours of careful travel, they came upon a hidden camp nestled in the hills. Fires burned low, and figures moved among the trees, men, women, and children, who looked up as they approached. The Apache greeted them with a nod, and though words were exchanged in a tongue she did not understand, she felt the tension ease from her body. Here at last was a place that felt alive with something other than fear. People gathered, their faces lined with hardship but their eyes carrying warmth. She was given water, food, and a blanket for her shoulders. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she sat among others without feeling the weight of judgment. Days passed in the camp. She learned that it was not just a refuge, but a place where many who had been driven from their homes came together. Some were Apache, some from other tribes, and some simply wanderers who had nowhere else to go. They shared what little they had, and each night the fires burned with quiet strength. She began to see the Apache not as a stranger, but as a man shaped by the same world that had tried to break her. He carried stories in his silence, stories of loss and survival, of battles fought not for glory but for the right to exist. In his presence, she began to believe that freedom was not just a dream, but something worth holding, even if it came at great cost. Still, the shadow of the men who had hunted them lingered. Scouts from the camp spoke of riders seen at the forest's edge, unwilling to give up their pursuit. The thought of being dragged back into chains haunted her nights, even as the camp gave her safety. She realized that the fight was not truly over, only paused. One evening, as the firelight flickered across the trees, she spoke to him again. "I don't know what comes next. I don't know how to live when every step feels like I'm still being hunted." He looked at her, his expression steady. "You live by choosing. Every day you choose not to break. That is freedom, even when the world tries to take it." His words stayed with her. She began to understand that freedom was not a gift given by others, but a choice she had to make for herself. She had chosen to run, chosen to trust him, and now she would choose to stand unbroken. When the riders finally came near again, the camp was ready. She watched as men and women took their places, their faces calm, their hands steady. The Apache stood at the front, his knife at his side, his eyes fixed on the horizon. She felt fear, yes, but alongside it, something stronger resolve. The sound of hooves echoed faintly through the forest, drawing closer with each passing moment. She tightened the blanket around her shoulders, her heart steady now, not with panic but with purpose. Whatever came, she knew she would not face it alone. She was no longer the woman standing on the auction block, waiting for her fate to be decided by others. She had escaped, and she had chosen to fight for the life that lay ahead. The night air carried the scent of smoke and pine, the firelight casting long shadows across the ground. She stood with the others, watching the darkness beyond the trees. The chase that had begun in the dust of the town was about to end, one way or another, and in that moment, she felt the truth of it settle deep inside her. Freedom was never simple, never safe, never guaranteed. It was a road carved with pain and struggle, a road walked only by those willing to keep moving forward no matter the cost. As the sound of the riders drew near, she drew in a breath and lifted her chin, ready to meet whatever the dawn would bring. The conflict that had shaped her journey was not a story of chains and escape alone. It was a story of spirit, of endurance, and of finding strength in the unlikeliest of places. The forest whispered around them, the fire crackled low, and the moment stretched into silence. The resolution still waited just beyond the horizon, but she knew now that no matter how it came, she would face it unbroken. Her story, once bound to an auction square, had become something greater, an old American tale of survival, defiance, and the unyielding search for freedom in a land as harsh as it was beautiful. And though the night held danger, it also held the promise of dawn.